As well as being Deputy Chair of the AEBC, I am also Programmes Advisor to an organisation called Green Alliance, which is an environmental NGO. AEBC is not just people with scientific expertise, it's people from a range of backgrounds, which I'll go into a little bit in a minute. But the sort of concerns I saw evolving during that time, which I think gave rise to the rationale for a body like the AEBC, included some of these. And the first one, certainly, that I was struck by talking to people in the course of talking about what the deliberate release regulations were doing, which are the ones that Adrian was talking about, what the food safety regulations were doing, which is a whole completely different set of regulations, looking at what it means to consume GM food, and also things like contained use, which is using GM in labs rather than out in the field. When we started to talk to people about how all these bits of regulation fitted together, one of the issues that often came up was, well, this is all very well. These things are trying to cater for the environmental or food or laboratory safety of these things, but have we actually had the debate as to whether we want them at all? About the principles of genetic manipulation, whether it's the right thing to be taking bits of DNA from one organism and putting it in another, whether crossing the species boundary is something we ought to be comfortable with or not. What are the sort of deeper ethical dimensions of doing this? And also the social implications in the sense of what does this mean economically? What does it mean to go down this kind of road? And that was often part of the debate. We've got these regulations in place for safety, but have we actually talked about whether this is the right thing on a more fundamental level? We go around the country, we don't have all our meetings in London, we go to different places, we've had public meetings, we've had debates, but we've never succeeded in getting, say, more than 100 people at best, and around a dozen people at worst to come along to a meeting in areas where there hasn't been the stimulus of specific trial sites. In those areas, as today, it's easy to get people motivated and involved. If you don't have that stimulus, then it's actually quite hard to get people interested enough to come and talk about it. So how do we get a large number of people actually involved in doing this and feeling that it's worthwhile? What kind of information do we give people? It's a very difficult one because people obviously don't want to be lectured to, they don't want to take on board a whole load of stuff they don't feel is relevant to their concerns, but at the same time, often people say, well, we do need more information to make up our mind about these things. So there's some very delicate balance to be drawn there, both about the kind of information and the way it's given. And then how do we synthesize these views into a report that's meaningful without injecting, some view from the people who are writing the report? Nobody comes to this, as I'm sure you've discovered, with a neutral point of view. It's very hard to write up anything in a neutral fashion, so we need to find a good way of doing that. And I feel most important, if we're going to hold this public debate and the government is going to spend a considerable amount of public money doing it, what do we see as being the indicators of a successful public debate? And I'd very much welcome this audience's views on that.
In the context of less developed countries using GM crops, if we look at Argentina, I'd just like to say that GM soybeans don't seem to be doing them an awful lot of good at the moment, and they have just recently opened up feeding stations because of the starvation that people are facing in Argentina at the moment because of economic collapse. So despite having GM soybeans, it's not it's not feeding them very well. And ever since the late 1980s, when the regulatory framework was first set up, as Julie said, the presumption was that this was good. It was good for the biotechnology industry, that for competitiveness of that particular sector of industry. And there was no assessment of its impact for different sectors of farming, for consumers more generally. It was just a rather myopic interpretation. And that, of course, is now, when you look at what's going on, not only in the UK but globally, comes down in GM crops to the economic interests of now what is 4 corporations, only 4 corporations, because of mergers and acquisitions and takeovers, then this great concentration inside DuPont, Bayer have now taken over Aventis, Syngenta and Monsanto. And the question I really want to ask in the context of the FSEs, because it's important to remember, we talked about the FSEs, but the FSEs have not just come out of just suddenly a decision to do some more science, to look at the biodiversity a little bit more carefully. They were politically driven. In 1998, there was a huge furore going on about GM crops. There's some very hard questioning going on about the justifications. And the government at that time and the industry, who were facing a difficult situation, did exactly what David was referring to when he gave his opening presentation. They tried to throw some science at it in order to buy some time to avoid some rather difficult political questioning around the ways in which judgments had been made in the past. And that's quite clear. What's happened, it's all gone a bit pear-shaped for them because it hasn't gone quite as smoothly as people say. It did become a focus for controversy, and now the whole thing is rather up in the air again. But these were politically motivated piece of science. It's not to say that the scientists who were involved in it were politically motivated or bad, but that is quite clearly where it came from. And it was thought that we could do this other bit of science and then we could decide about commercialisation, that the future commercialisation of GM crops in this country was meant to hang on the outcome of the FSEs. And along with that, if you buy into that picture, you have to accept that all the other studies on safety have been adequate, and that this is the final bit in the jigsaw. And also, I also, because we haven't heard any of that today, want to remind us to keep in our mind, again, that science is uncertain. It doesn't deal in facts at all. It can't tell us what isn't going to happen. That there is also ignorance. Surprises do happen, and I should think that one predictable thing is that the first adverse effect that we get from GM crops will be a surprise. It's probably the most predictable thing. It's something we won't have thought of, I suspect. So keep that in mind when we talk about these things. And also, because of that, because of those factors, there's always limits on our ability to predict. And how things are handled, how they really pan out, will depend on human behaviour, human nature, farming practices, in a way which has been very poorly predicted in the past.
What I want to talk about in a general context is why we think that it is a technology which is desirable and necessary in a UK context. And so I don't want to discuss list all the possible benefits just as a catalogue, but talk about them in some context. And those factors in agriculture are, of course, moderated by public opinion and taste. You have to produce products which the public wish to buy in whatever form it's available to them, and they have to want to buy it, because this is a question of a willing public willingly buying material produced by willing producers. There is an element of public discussion, which is there some of the time. Most of our history, at least most of my lifetime, people have not had major public discussions about food issues, but clearly they have in recent times, and that's influenced the whole agricultural scene. Consumer choice, nowadays, as I said, influenced very largely by the major retailers. So if the major retailers, as many of them have said, we will not include GM products, at least in our house brand foods, that means that people do not have a choice of buying GM foods if they want to, because the supermarkets have essentially withdrawn that choice from them. So it's a factor in determining what farmers can sell, for example, if the supermarkets are not going to market. An advantage which has been published recently about the use of BT cotton in China, where the claim was made, and this was published in a reputable journal, in Science, which is one of the major scientific journals in the Western world, there is a claim of a reduction of something like 80% in the cost of the insecticides which are used to control the cotton crop in China, and an overall saving to the farmer of about 28% in input costs. That's labour costs in distributing the insecticide, the cost of the tractor time and the tractor fuels, and the impact on the fields and all the rest of it. Adding together, in this paper, there was a claim of 28% reduction. Now, biotechnology, and this is the last point I want to make, is not just about transgenics. There are other ways in which modern gene technology can be used to produce a crop. So consider this situation. Suppose you can modify an existing gene by a technique which is called gene surgery. So you identify and isolate the gene in the plant which you want to modify, and then you mutate that gene in the lab, but it comes from the plant, not a foreign gene, and then you put the mutant gene back into the plant from which you got it, or its close friend, and as a result you have a genetically modified plant with no foreign genes. And what you then say about that, is that a GM plant? And so one way forward might be to combine the best of biotechnology and organic farming, if one can get the two sides to agree on how to do that. One can ask what it would take to do it. One can ask, would it be worth the effort? And one can ask, worth it for whom? That's always a question which you have to ask. For whom is the benefit?